Today we continue our discoveries of the Dark Mother Lolth by following her plunge into the abyssal depths. Banished and now transformed into a demonic Tanar'ri, Lolth now spins her sinister webs of treachery to carve her own dominion in the birthplace of pure evil. Surrounded by the deceit and ambition of countless demonic lords, we will witness her conquest of those that stand in her dark path, her ascension to godhood. There is much to tell about the Queen of Spiders, from the secrets of her Demonweb lair and those that opposed her, to some obscure and alternative lore, and those that now serve her. All before her gaze ever fixed upon the dark elves of Faerun. The rise of the Queen of the Demonweb pits, Lolth. Right now on Riches and Liches. The portal from Sigil spat you out into the abyss like so much refuse. You take a moment to let your eyes adjust to the dread darkness before quickly confirming you've reached your destination, although you now wonder why you were in such a rush to get here. This is the Demonweb, the 66th layer of the abyss, and it is every bit the festering nightmare you had been warned about. Standing on the edge of a vast expanse, an endless mesh of webs and tunnels stretch out in every direction, only to disappear into an oppressive mist. The silken threads you stand on glisten with the grisly remnants of those who had wandered too far into this, the lair of the Spider Queen. Their crimson remains a grim reminder of the future that awaits the unprepared. Looking below, you see a yawning, endless void of oily blackness, a chasm so deep its very sight seems to pull your soul off balance. The webbed threads crisscross above and below you, forming bridges of silken terrors over the pits that give this abyssal domain its name. Each step feels like a dance with fate, your equilibrium threatening to cast you into the null below. The very definition of a labyrinthine structure, the Demonweb is both mesmerizing and horrifying. The air is thick with the stench of decay, a foul mix of rot and something you can't quite describe, but know it's far worse. It's heavy and offensively clings to your exposed skin. As it fills your lungs with every required breath, you know instantly that it's a vile foulness you can't place, but will never forget. The webs beneath your feet seem to pulse with life, whispering faint haunting cries from the tormented. Everywhere you look, the Demonweb is overrun with spiders, some no larger than a grain of rice, others as large as a house cat. Giant arachnids with eyes that gleam in this realm's perpetual twilight. You feel their presence, 1,000 eyes tracking your every move. But you've done your homework, being mindful and deliberate with each step, for fear of drawing the Spider Queen's ire should you harm any of her 8-legged children, no matter how tiny. A moment later, your eyes catch something far larger in the dim light. A group of bright yellow, amorphous, tentacled blobs of viscous slime, as large or larger than the humans in your own group. That was the smell your mind instantly registers. Yaklal demons, putrid, vile, and so inaccurately named as Lolth's handmaidens. One might easily mistake these repulsive demons for an ever-melting candle if not for the overpowering and indescribable stench. They have clearly spotted you and are heading in your direction, their forms shifting and bubbling, staining the webs with trails of their noxious fluids in their wake. It's time to act. And to think you were enjoying a cold ale and a warm fire not even an hour ago. Welcome to the Demonweb pits. That scenario is not unlike one that a former member of the Elven Pantheon likely experienced when she arrived upon this abyssal lair approximately 31,000 years ago, a lair that she now calls home. Indeed, the luxury of hindsight tells us that few evil powers across the realms inspire as much fear and malevolent cruelty as Lolth, the Queen of Spiders. But while the history books tell us the Demonweb pits would become her domain, and that she was destined to be the goddess of the Dark Elf Drow, it would not be handed over to her lightly. she would have to fight and scheme her way to the top, challenged with every step. Originally a minor deity of the arts known as Araushni, she was once a goddess of the elven pantheon known as the Seldarine, and she was renowned for her beauty and skill as the weaver of destinies. Her fall from the grace of Corellon Lorethian and subsequent transformation into Lolth is a tale of ambition and betrayal that serve as the genesis for the Spider Queen. If you are not familiar with those earliest origins that lead us to our discoveries today, I would strongly recommend you check out our Volume 7 Part 1 video on Lolth in order to have the full context. You can find a link to that lore volume below and above right about now. We begin our discoveries directly after the end of that Part 1 video. Araushni, now exiled from Arvindor and banished into the Abyss by her former consort turned archenemy, Corellon Lorethian, the first of the Seldarine and father of the Elven people. This act turning her once graceful dark elven form into a monstrous demonic spider of twisted terror and faint remnant of her beauty. Upon her arrival into the birthplace of demonkind, Araushni, now free from any and all pretense or veneers concealing her true nature, quickly did exactly as Corellon had decreed: become what you are and go where you must. Araushni's first action was to cast aside her elven heritage, taking the name Lolth and then setting forth to find her place among the demonic powers in this, the Cradle of Chaos. And so began her quest of the 66th lair known as the Demonweb. However, Lolth had a problem. Araushni may have changed her name, but she is far removed from the lofty titles as the Queen of Spiders or Goddess of the Drow we know today. No longer a deity, not even a demon lord at this point. She is a Tanar'ri demon, a powerful one to be sure, but we must remember, emerging, exiled into this abyss of anarchy, Lolth found herself surrounded by demonic lords and evil entities on all sides, while stripped of the divine portfolios she used to wield as the goddess Araushni. Scholars and theologians have long debated the sequence of events that would unfold during this obscure early period of Lolth's history and ascension. While the exact chronology remains speculative, a plausible timeline can be constructed from the fragmented and certainly conflicting lore that we do have. And to do that, we must first turn our attention to her earliest interactions with the malicious powers in these chaotic wastes: Godhood, the ancient and primordial deity known as That Which Lurks. If you recall from our Volume 7 Part 1 on Lolth, in the midst of Araushni's third betrayal, the War of the Seldarine, Godhood arrived to take part in that battle, but he did so as an uninvited guest, not part of the planned army gathered to march on Arvindor that day. And that fact now becomes even more significant to our tale. Godhood, not privy or part of that allied army of evil, was drawn to and allowed to breach onto the plain of Arvindor only by the significant presence of elven evil and betrayal that radiated from Araushni that day. And so the Ancient One was able to complete his unannounced arrival during the War of the Seldarine through a portal of his own making. And according to the texts of many Candlekeep scholars, when he retreated from the battlefield that day, he may have left his path back into the abyssal depths open behind him. Subsequently, not long after, as Corellon cast Araushni into the lawless abyss, it is believed that the Lord of Elves banished her into that very portal used by Godhood, and not one created separately. While this, along with most any lore this ancient, cannot be 100% proven as fact, it should be considered a strong theory, as it does align well with the events to follow, connecting a few dots almost perfectly. Chief among them is explaining how Lolth would find herself upon the same 66th lair that Godhood called home, the 66th among the endless and uncountable layers of the ever-shifting abyss. Either this same portal theory is true, or that is one mother of a coincidence. Yet upon that numbered lair she arrived, expelled into the lap of the Lord of Slimes, and it is here that Lolth would find herself, not under threat, but warmly greeted by the ancient and repulsive evil, a scenario that would prove to be the most fortuitous of outcomes. With the name Araushni now forever cast aside, Lolth emerges onto this abyssal scene as a fragment of the goddess she once was. This is Lolth at the nadir of her powers and in her most vulnerable state. In this earliest time, Lolth would rely far more on her emotional talents than any intrinsic powers or might. While our discoveries here are mired in missing and even conflicting lore, I've reviewed every shred of what has been documented in order to fill in the lore gaps, and piece together my own theories on the sequence of events to follow. Keep in mind that in these most ancient of times, all that we have are theories and contradictions. There is no official and universally accepted lore outside the core mythology, that she arrived upon the abyss and proceeded to take over, becoming the goddess she is today. But the myriad of obstacles, challenges, and opposing forces that lie before her, along with the tangled web of details and chronologies, are the most fascinating, and I have left no lore stone unturned in these vague and esoteric times. So while you should look at all the lore in this age with a critical eye, I think you'll find my conclusions are some of the most plausible, while filling in the obscure gaps nicely. I would start by offering that the landscape awaiting Lolth as she arrived was one where there existed not one but two abyssal lairs that would require conquering. The 66th lair, as is well documented, but also the 65th lair, which we will get to in a moment. So Lolth arrives on Ganondor's abyssal home, the 66th lair, in an age before it was the Demonweb. Lolth would find this as a grotesque realm of slime and decay, the air thick with the stench of rot and a cloying miasma. Vast pits of primordial ooze churn sluggishly, their surfaces bubbling with foul gases and the occasional sickening plop of a new slime being birthed from its depths. Here the massive pits serve as the master bedroom, if you will, for the Lord of Slimes. As Ganondor sleeps, a titanic, amorphous mass of putrid sludge. All around, the ground squelches and clings with every step, a sickening landscape where bioluminescent fungi cast the realm's only light as an eerie, blue-shifted glow, their faint light revealing the lurking horrors that make this lair home. Black puddings, their acidic touch melting flesh and bone with a sizzling hiss. Ghastly slimes that grasp and consume any organic matter. Gelatinous beings, yes, some of them cubes, each a quivering mass of translucent horror pulsing with its own inner, nauseating light. And oozes, shapeless blobs constantly releasing their own vile stench, so thick you can see the foul air settle on its grotesque form. These repulsive creatures glide and slither about, leaving their own distinct and repugnant trails, and each possessing a malevolent intelligence unknown in those species today. This is a realm, a lair, far different than the Demonweb of today, one dominated by the noxious presence of the Lord of Slimes. Lolth would take in this ghastly scene, knowing she had little power relative to the forces around her, and even less influence, but that would quickly start to change during her extended time cohabitating with Ganondor. I want to call out here that the Lord of Slimes in this early era was significantly more powerful than the banished goddess turned spider demon. As early as negative 25,100, Ganondor had already amassed great power, easily surpassing that of a typical demon lord or lesser deity. We know this because the Lord tells us that beyond his following of intelligent oozes, jellies, and slimes, he had begun to gain traction among the humanoid races, as evidenced by at least two prominent elves upon Toril, an Illithir mage of a Tornash named Tanar'ri, who will play a pivotal role much later in our coverage of the Goddess of the Drow, and Prince Durathil, the first dragon rider, who I covered in Volume 5 of this series. Each had dealings with and or worshipped Ganondor as their god. And it is for these reasons that I can confidently proclaim that in this time before Lolth would reach the zenith of her own powers, that Ganondor, had he so wished, could have easily vanquished her. But he didn't. Why? Because the Lord of Slimes had bigger plans plans that revolved around his own infatuation, perhaps even love, for the future Spider Queen. The transformation of Araushni into Lolth only heightened her already strong allure to Ganador. Her cruel and ruthless nature captivated him in ways that transcend our mortal understanding. Born from a profound loneliness as a deity often overlooked and ridiculed by his deific peers, slandered and shamed as a god whose worshippers primarily consisted of oozes, slimes, and other aberrant creatures that were reviled and considered unwanted outcasts, Ganador found in Lolth a kindred spirit, one who had also faced rejection and transformed it into a strength. She would provide him the status and respect that he so desired. If ever a godlike entity existed that could think fate had brought love into his lap, it was Ganador. And it was this emotional entanglement that gave Lolth, as the master manipulator she was, a clear path to power. Exploiting the weakness of Ganador's affection allowed Lolth to buy herself time, garner strength, and even receive gifts of power and assistance from the Big Daddy Slime Lord. Fate, it would seem, would once again have a pivotal role to play in Lolth's continued ascension. Lolth would waste no time putting her sinister schemes into motion, taking full advantage of her influence with Ganador. Some sources claim Lolth's first major act of conquest was the subjugation of Kiaran Sali, the dark elven lich and lesser deity of the undead. However, in my research, this theory seems highly implausible and one of the most unlikely of scenarios. Kiaran Sali, the vengeful banshee of Threnody, had already established herself as a necromantic deity of some renown and significant power long before Araushni was even banished. Any notion that Lolth, in her nascent demonic state, could have subdued such a potent entity is far too large a leap in logic. Let's not forget that this is the same Kiaran Sali that would later kill Orcus. That's a great story for another day, but it did happen, it's canon. The Lady of Dead is no joke. Instead, it is far more likely that any confrontation with the Revenancer would have occurred later, after Lolth had amassed greater power. Biding her time until then, Lolth, wielding her allure and a deceitful but effective charm over Ganador, leveraged his affection to secure gifts benefiting her own selfish desires. We know that his attempts to gain Lolth's favor were marked by those such gifts, even extending to alterations of his own slimy amorphous creatures to serve her needs. The most obvious of those would be the Yaklaw demons that serve the Spider Queen to this very day. In time, through her manipulation, Lolth accumulated the power necessary to defeat other lesser demonic powers lost to time, and bolstering her own in the process, all in order to elevate herself to the status of a demon lord. And it would not be long after her leveling up that Lolth would set upon the first of many conquests. This would not be an encounter with the Lady of the Dead, but another entity on another lair. His name was Xanazu, a demon lord who controlled that 65th lair. The conquest of Xanazu as Lolth's first conquest makes sense on so many levels. One facet of her makeup that has never been in dispute as either Araushni or Lolth was her intelligence, and Xanazu as a demon lord was a minor power compared to Kiaran Sali or Ganador to be sure. But more critically to Lolth and on a personal level, Xanazu had the temerity to claim suzerainty over the domain of spiders, something Lolth found unacceptable, drawing her ire and rage, a target she would not resist. And if all that were not enough evidence to confirm this theory, then remember this. Lolth, currently living in the gruesome pits of primordial slime, as the guest and roomie of Ganador, was likely more than ready for a place of her own. The lore is conflicted regarding the exact method of Xanazu's downfall. Some scholars suggest that Lolth enlisted the help of the love-struck Ganador, while others, including myself, believe she used deceit and some family ties, tricking the lesser deity Selvatarm, who was in fact her grandson, into executing Xanazu, an act that would not only secure Xanazu's lair as her own, but would also corrupt Selvatarm, compelling the lesser deity to serve Lolth as her champion and thereby becoming her first vassal. There is a ton more to this story, as Selvatarn provides a tangled but interesting web of lore himself, a tale we may well revisit in a later volume in my Deities and Demigod series, so let me know down below if that's something you'd find interesting. Regardless of the method, this conquest was a critical milestone in Lolth's grand power play, as acquiring Xanazu's domain portfolio over Spider-kind, as well as any meager following he held, nonetheless provided Lolth with a significant boost in her own powers and influence. Additionally, Lolth now possessed control of her own realm, away from the watchful and leering eye of the Lord of Slimes. This victory marked a notable turning point for Lolth, allowing her to secure a foothold in the abyssal power structures, no longer vulnerable to every other demonic power, and officially earning her the title of Queen of Spiders. And it was only through these sinister accomplishments that the Queen of Spiders was now in a more advantageous position, where her battle with Kiaran Sali at least makes a whole lot more sense from the standpoint of matchups and powers. Here too, the lore on their conflict is as barren as the Anauroch Desert, with every source, nearly a dozen in total, simply stating that Lolth defeated the Necromancer Queen and subjugated her into a compelling, if unwilling, vassal. And it's here that I want to add a brief editorial. I firmly believe that Kiaran Sali is one of the more underrated and underutilized of the Forgotten Realms deities. Now, to be precise, the Vengeful Banshee actually originated as a powerful mortal necromancer and then goddess in the Greyhawk universe, which may explain why she is not given any love in the realms. Bad blood runs deep. I have her on my shortlist for a full video profile to gather all that we do know about this Drow Lady of the Dead, and I believe after I've shared all that I've learned about the Revenancer, you too will agree she's worth incorporating into your world-building efforts. Nevertheless, the subjugation of Kiaran Sali would, even more than Xanazu, further empower the Spider Queen. With the necromantic goddess serving as yet another compelled and powerful vassal, coupled with control over the 65th lair of the Abyss, a realm that history would call the Court of the Spider Queen, Lolth's power and influence were quickly becoming more than noteworthy. But the Queen of Spiders knew that soon, Ganador was going to pose a problem and an obstacle to her intended dominion and status in the Abyss. But like all things in love and war, timing is everything. As you have likely already guessed, Ganador's infatuation with Lolth was not destined to end well, unfolding as a tale of envy, lust, and ultimately disappointment, and worse. Lolth, ever the schemer, continued to use Ganador's obsession to exploit rather than reciprocate, using her duplicitous allure by feigning interest and flattering the Slime Lord just enough to maintain his fascination and maximize her influence, doing so without any genuine or binding commitment, all while she plotted the next sinister step in her corrupt schemes. As Lolth's power grew, Ganador, fully enamored with the Spider Queen, grew restless, continually pressing harder with his attempts to court, even proposing that he take the place of Coralon as her consort. His offer was a grand alliance, where together they would form a new evil pantheon and rule the 66th and 65th lair together. However, Lolth's plans never included a partner, and by this time the Spider Queen had amassed enough power to at least challenge him openly. No longer needing to maintain the ruse or any illusion of interest, she not only rebuffed his proposal, she rejected him with open contempt. The lore recounts Lolth's cruelty here, detailing her mockery of the Slime Lord, hurling insults aimed directly at his vile appearance and repulsive form, laughing at the very suggestion that she, a goddess of beauty and desire, would ever lower herself to be with such a pathetic creature. One can only speculate how history might have been rewritten had Ganador, not stung by Cupid's arrow, decided to vanquish instead of court upon Lolth's arrival. His infatuation with her was a dangerous vulnerability, one that Lolth exploited to its fullest. Leading Ganador on with hollow promises and artificial flattery, The Lord of Slime was nothing more than a pawn, one Lolth meticulously manipulated to secure her own ascendancy, only to discard him once he was no longer of use. In her defense, have you seen what Ganador looks like? I mean, she was married to a very pretty elf in Corellon, so can you blame a girl? Regardless, whether the open mockery was simply her innate cruelty unleashed and finally bubbling to the surface, or as some scholars posit, just another facet of her master plan designed to enrage the Lord of Slimes into an errant mistake, is up for debate. But we know now with the clarity of hindsight that a mistake it was, making it easy to draw the conclusion that Ganador, through a series of ill-fated decisions and self-inflicted wounds, all driven by emotion, may be the primary reason that Lolth is the dark goddess of cruelty she is today. And perhaps Ganador did as much as anyone else in history to seal the fate of the dark elf Elithir, who we must point out at this stage of history are not even known to Lolth, a fact that will become far more relevant deeper into our discoveries. As we move out of the courting phase and into one of conflict, Ganador's reaction to this rejection and mockery was swift and brutal. And by brutal I mean to his own fortunes, characterized by some absolutely baffling choices made. It's hard to look back on the lore and not conclude that Ganador was in fact the author of his own defeat. While the details are scant, we do know a few things. During this courting phase, one manipulated and extended by Lolth, the Spider Queen grew in power with each passing day. Where one could easily see, in fact almost guarantee, her defeat at the hands of Ganador early in her exile, by the time of her openly mocking his overtures of love and alliance, a lot had changed across this chaotic landscape. The delta in Lolth's power and influence since her exile as the banished Tanar'ri was now considerable. The Queen of Spiders, having gained dominion over vast new powers, securing her own lair, and having defeated or subjugated many demon lords, and not one but two lesser deities, both of which were now in her service, Lolth no longer needed to rely on emotional games and deceit. She was the Queen of Spiders, and the next step in her deific evolution required dominion over Ganador's realm, so that she could create her Demonweb lair. As the clash of spiders and slime unfolded, both the abyssal powers would learn victory would not come easy. We know from a line in Chapter 8 of the excellent novel Evermeet Island of Elves that Lolth's struggle with Ganador was, quote, long and bitter. At some point in their extended battle for dominion, Ganador, no longer blinded by love, begins to see the true cost of his infatuation. Yet the ancient evil only compounded his mistakes through his continued underestimating of Lolth and/or overconfidence in his own power. Ganador eventually will come to fully understand the gravity of his battle with Lolth, his realization that the empowered Queen of Spiders is now a formidable threat, albeit coming far too late. But the blunders do not stop there. Enraged and humiliated, Ganador seems bound and determined to write his name into history as one of the more bewildering and mistake-prone gods. As in his rage, the Slime Lord blaming his worshippers for the lack of respect he carried among abyssal powers and maybe for his rejection at the hands of Lolth, made the ill-fated decision to curse those most devoted to him, his own followers. Now, you might have noticed a bit earlier, I described Ganador's followers, specifically the various oozes, slimes, and jellies, as intelligent. And yet any neophyte adventurer would know that those abominations of today are something far less than the critical thinkers of Faerun. Well, Ganador's curse, it turns out, a self-inflicted injury if ever one existed, is the origin for that change. In those ancient times, approximately negative 30,000 Dale reckoning, those oozes, slimes, and jellies possessed an alien-like level of high intelligence. However, Ganador, enraged by Lolth's many mockeries, decided to steal away the intelligence from the vast majority of his worshippers, specifically those oozes, slimes, and jellies. This would not only align with our modern-day understanding of those slimes as the run-of-the-mill low-intelligence fodder they are, but more critical to our studies in this volume, his worshippers, now diminished in their own capacity, could no longer uphold the rituals and devotions that had thus far sustained his power. Lolth, on the other hand, as intelligent as she is cruel, demonstrated once again her ability to turn any situation to her advantage, absorbing some of Ganondor's own Forsaken followers into her own ranks, further bolstering her power. Even with the most sympathetic interpretation, Ganondor's decision to rob his followers of their intelligence appears misguided. Using the strongest pair of pro-Ganondor lenses I can find, one might posit that he intended the curse to redirect their stolen intellect towards a singular purpose, perhaps an attempt to somehow conquer or otherwise compel Lolth, but even that is a stretch that's not supported by any canonical lore. The reality of the historical record is that Ganondor most certainly seems to have once again been driven by emotion, his wounded pride, and an all-consuming blind rage directing his actions far more than any coherent tactical strategy. Regardless, it was a blunder of epic proportions, as Ganondor's resulting weakened state, coupled with Lolth's own ascending powers, allowed Lolth to depose Ganondor as the seat of power on the 66th lair. Thoroughly defeated, the Lord of Slime was left with no followers and just a minute fraction of his former power. In this conquered and depleted state, Ganondor became yet another, the third in fact, compelled vassal of Lolth, serving the Spider Queen from the pits of the Demonweb, who along with Kiaran Sali and the champion of Lolth, Selvatarm, now formed the unwilling basis for the creation of the Drow pantheon that would come to be known as the Dark Seldarine. It should be noted here as we close out this volume that many millennia later, in the era of upheaval circa 1379 Dale Reckoning, Ganondor was said to finally escape, or as many scholars believe was merely allowed to leave, released by Lolth to depart the Demonweb. The ancient primordial eventually making his way to the Dismal Caverns, a realm upon the elemental plane of ooze where he has slowly begun to rebuild his divine portfolio, and likely his pride over the last century. Lolth, the Spider Queen of the Demonweb pits, had overwhelmed every chaotic force encountered during this ancient era, en route to securing her name as a mighty power to be reckoned in the power structures of this abyssal hierarchy. Yet we have barely scratched the surface of one of the most lore-rich powers in all the realms. Lolth, now having conquered her realm on the 65th and 66th lair, has had several millennia to remove the residue slime and fashion her dominion in her own image. This means that in our next volume, the Queen of Spiders will be ready to present a proper tour of the Demonweb, including the nearly 24 locations and demi-planes connected to this fascinating lair. And all this before we detail one of the more compelling series of events in all of Realm's lore. Seemingly unrelated events that by a fateful chain reaction would forever change history by turning Lolth's attention to a new realm, replete with new souls to corrupt. Lolth's gaze upon Faerun. Thank you, fellow lore scholars, for giving me the opportunity to share today's lore. I truly love the work that lets us discover new lore together, an endeavor that is only possible through your continued support. And a very special thank you to my Patreon supporters. If you'd like to support the channel as I attempt to keep the content sponsor-free, please check out the links below. Free Patreon memberships, free Discord access, and a Buy Me a Coffee donation link. And if you think I earned it, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening, and until next time, remember, the only limitation at your table is your imagination.